Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to go back and talk about solving equations, but we're going to go in a little bit more depth so we can understand where the equations come from. So by the end of the video, you should be able to explain why the steps of solving a one-variable equation make sense. So we're going to start with one-step equations. So let's say you have the equation x minus 7 equals 32. What this equation really means is I have some number, and when I subtract 7, it equals 32. So when I say verbal description of equation, if you can translate this into a sentence, it's going to be easier to understand. So what the question is asking you to solve for is the answer to this. When you have a number, some number, I don't know what that number is, and you take away 7, take away 7, the result is 32. Okay, so this is my sum number. This is me taking away 7. The result should be 32. And a lot of you could answer this in your head, and you'd probably say, let's see, what can I subtract 7 from, get 32? Hopefully you'd say that number is x equals 39. 39 minus 7 equals 32. And you can probably guess and check that. Okay, that's one way to do it, but it won't always be so easy to guess and check. So that's why we need to understand the solving steps. Okay, so what we need to do is get x alone. In order to do that, we got to move away everything that's bothering the x. So if this is minus 7, we undo that by adding 7, because minus 7 and plus 7 makes 0. So that will cancel on this side, and you'll have x equals 32 plus 7 gives you 39. So you can guess and check it, or you can solve for it. Now, why does that work? I like to call this backtracking. You're working backward. So I'm ending with 32. After I've subtracted 7, let me add 7 to 32 to figure out what that number would need to be. Now, if I plugged in 39, I'd have 39 minus 7 is 32, and that would work. So you're doing the opposite operations so you can work backwards. I'm going to pause the video and leave this in this for you to try on your own. I'll come back with the answer. But do these on your own first so you can test what you know. Pause the video now if you haven't already. Okay, here are the answers. You can check yours with mine because you did them on your own. Let's start with the verbal description of the equation. So x plus 5 equals negative 62 really means I have some number. I don't know what it is, so I'll call x. X is like my placeholder. When I add 5 to it, the result is negative 62. Okay, so this equal sign means the result is this. So I got to backtrack and say, what number could I add 5 to and get a negative number, which is kind of tricky. So in order to get a negative number and add 5 to it and still have a negative number, my answer is going to have to be negative. Because if I add like a positive number, like 10 plus 5, it's going to be a positive number. So x has to be negative, which once I solved it, it is. And if you can make sense of your equations this way, you're going to be a lot better at solving because you're going to be able to figure out if your answer makes sense or not. So if you think about it, you got to work backwards. So if I know I got to add 5, let me subtract 5 to figure out what that number is. So if I do that, negative 62 and negative 5, your negative number is getting bigger. So it's like you're in debt $62, and then I take 5 more away. Now you're going to be in debt more. So you're going to be in debt negative $67. Okay, this one says I have some number, x, and I'm multiplying it by 2. The result is 50. So the question you should be asking yourself is, what number can I multiply by 2 to get 50? So the number I'd have to multiply by 2 would be 25. So you can just kind of think and guess and check that way, or we can work backwards and undo the stuff. So 50 divided by 2 gives us 25. That means if I multiplied 25 by 2, I'd get 50. Okay, this last one we're going to do together. So it says 1/2 x equals 50. So what this means is 1/2 times x equals 50. So what number can you take half of to get 50? So what number is 50 half of? Okay, you can either think about it. If I think about it, I would say, oh, x is 100. Because if I take 1/2 of 100, it'll give me 50. Okay, or the other way you can do this is by undoing the operations. And this is where it gets tricky. So I'm going to clear some space here. So this is 1/2 times x. And how do you undo multiplication? You divide. Now, dividing by a fraction is really, really not nice. So this is one option. And if you do 50 divided by 1/2 or 50 divided by 0.5 in your calculator, you get 100. Okay, the other way to think about this might be a little bit nicer. And you have to undo a half. You can undo a half by multiplying by 2. If you have 2, which is really 2 over 1, times 1/2, it equals 1. So if I multiply this by 2, these will cancel. And then you're going to multiply the other side by 2 as well, because whatever you do one side, you have to do the other, and 50 times 2 is 100. Okay, so either way you slice it, if you divide by half or multiply by 2, it means the same thing, and you'll still get 100. So the verbal description of this equation is I'm taking a half of some number, and the result is 50. That number would have to be 100. Okay, now we're going to move on to two-step equations, which will kind of combine both things. We're going to have some multiplication and we're going to have some addition, subtraction. So what this says is if we take 3 times some number and subtract 14, the result will be 37. So take 3 multiplied by some number, and then you subtract 14, or take away 14. The result is 37. So you can kind of think this through and say, okay, I have to multiply 3 by some number, subtract 14 to get 37. This number would have to be kind of big, because if I do 3 times 2 of 6 minus 14, and that's not going to give me 37. So x is going to kind of have to be a big number. So maybe I'll try like 3 times 10, but that would be 30 minus 14. If you have $30 and I take away 14, you're not going to get 37. It's going to have to be bigger. And you can try and guess and check it that way, but it's going to take you a lot longer. So this is why we want to learn those solving steps so we can save ourselves some time. So if we're trying to get x alone, we got to undo everything that's bothering the x. I'm going to add 14 to this. Add 14 to both sides. That's what I wanted there. Okay, so the reason that works is you have a minus 14 and plus 14, and that means they cancel. It's like you're in debt $14, but then I give you $14. Now you just have none because you paid back your debts. So then I'll get 3x equals 14 plus 37. Let's see, that's 40, 51. Okay, so now that you got your numbers on one side and your variables on the other, you can just isolate the x. In order to do that, this says 3 times x. I can divide both sides by 3. And I'll get x equals whatever 51 divided by 3 is. 3 is 17. And I probably wouldn't have guessed 17 right off the bat. It would have taken me a while, and that's why it's good to have these solving steps. So let's kind of consider why this makes sense again. One way you can make sense of it is by plugging it back in and kind of thinking about what you just did. So x is 17. That means this is 17. So if I take 3 and multiply by 17 and subtract 14, I'll get 37. And we already know that 3 times 17 is going to give me 51. So this really says 51 minus 14 equals 37. And if I take 51 and subtract 14, I'll get that it's 37. So then I get a true statement, which means it works. Okay, but ultimately, if you're starting with original number, you want to work backwards to figure out what that number is going to be. So if you're subtracting 14 from it, you want to add 14 to undo that subtraction. If you're multiplying that number by 3 to get it, you want to divide by 3 to figure out what you started with, which you can kind of see here how that works. A few more problems. Again, what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you pause the video and try these guys on your own. I'll come back with the answer. Okay, no cheating. Make sure you pause it so you get the chance to practice. Okay, now you should be checking what you did on your own. You should have got x is negative 2 and x is 20. So starting in this one says negative 2 times some number plus 7 equals 11. Okay, if you think about it, what that number could be, I have negative 2 times some number plus a positive number is going to equal a positive number. So if I multiply negative 2 by positive, this is going to be negative. But I know my solution, my result has got to be positive. So the only thing you could multiply negative 2 by to make it a positive is another negative. That's why my x is negative here, because a negative times a negative is a positive. So if you have x being a negative, you're multiplying by a negative, you get a positive here, plus another positive number here, equals a positive number. If you had just gotten that x was positive 2, you would have negative 2 times 2, which is negative 4, plus 7 is not going to give you a bigger positive number. So you need to start making sense of your answers in that way. Okay, so again, this equation says I take negative 2, multiply it by some number, I add 7, I get 11. Whereas this one's slightly different. It says you take some number and divide it by 4, and then you're going to subtract 7 from it, and you'll get negative 2. My answer is 20, so let's see what that means, really. So really, if x is 20, I'm going to plug that in for x. So I have 20 divided by 4 minus 7 equals negative 2. So 20 divided by 4 is 5. So now I have 5 minus 7 equals negative 2. And 5 minus 7 is negative 2, so that works. So you need to find some number that when you divide it by 4 and then subtract 7, you get negative 2. And you have two options. You can either guess and check it, or you can solve it. So in order to solve it, it's the same thing. You want to get your numbers on one side first and your variables on the other. So since the variables are on the left, I'm going to move the numbers to the right. If this is minus 7, I'm going to add 7, which is what I did here. Okay, then you had x divided by 4 equals 5. So this is x divided by 4. How do you undo division? Multiplication undoes division, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 4. Okay, if I do that, I get x is 20, which makes sense because 20 divided by 4 does equal 5. But again, if you're trying to undo multiplication, you're going to divide. But if you're trying to undo division, you got to multiply. So you're always doing the opposite operation. Okay, so we're going to do another one with some division. So this is, okay, let's start small here. So you're going to take something and divide it by 2, and you get 4. So if I take something and divide it by 2 to get 4, this something would have to be 8, because 8 divided by 2 is 4. So that means x plus 3 has to equal 8. Yeah, x plus 3 has to equal 8, because the numerator would be 8 divided by 2 is 4. Okay, how did I get that? Well, right now you have division by 2, so you're dividing by 2. In order to undo division, we multiply. So multiply by 2 and divide by 2, those cancel. Whatever you do to one side, you do the other. So I get 4 times 2 is 8, which is what you see here. So you can either think about it, or you can do the solving steps. Now to get x alone, I got to move the numbers to the other side. So with that, I get x equals 5. Okay, so you can always check this. I have 5 plus 3 is 8, which is what I wanted, because 8 divided by 2 is 4. Okay, and the more you think about what you're doing when you're solving, and the more you check your answers, and the more you ask yourself if your answer makes sense, the easier this is going to get. So that's my advice, and please take it. Before you kind of end this video, I want to give you one more visual to help. I know back in the day you've seen some function machines, and I think they're really helpful actually. So let's go back to this equation. You had 3x minus 14 equals 37. So if you think about this as a machine, you're inputting x. Whatever you do to x, the first thing you're going to do is multiply by 3. And then you're going to subtract 14, and the output should be 37. Okay, that's what this equation says. 3x minus 14 equals 37. So multiply x by 3, subtract 47, you get 37 as an output. When you're solving an equation, instead of going forwards through the function machine, you're going backwards. So I would go this way. So I'm going to start with 37, and if I'm going forwards, I want to subtract 14, but if I'm going backwards, I want to add 14. Okay, now I was multiplying by 3 to go forwards, but to go backwards, I would divide by 3. So I take 37 and add 14, I get 51. Then going backwards through the function machine, you got to divide by 3 to move through the other way. So I don't know if this visual helps or not, but it's another thing you can kind of think about is going backwards through the function machine to help you understand. Please, if you have any questions, I would write them down on the sheet so you can ask when you see me next. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.